For 14 years, I believed I was married to a man I knew completely. He coached Little League on Saturdays, remembered my coffee order, and told me I was the love of his life every single morning. Every single morning. I have spent the last 2 years trying to understand how a person does that. And I have finally run out of the need to understand it. This is what happened instead. There were 2 women crying at my husband's graveside on a Tuesday morning in November, and only one of them knew about the other. A woman I had never seen before was standing on the opposite side of the grave with a boy of about 8 and a girl who looked maybe 5, and she was holding them the way you hold children when you need them to anchor you to the earth. She was wearing a black coat. She had his last name. And when the pastor said his name, our husband's name, she flinched the exact same way I did. I noticed her before the service ended. I told myself it was a co-worker, a family friend, someone from the part of his life that had always been vaguely described as work stuff and old friends. My brain was doing what brains do in the first 48 hours of grief. It was protecting me from information I wasn't ready to process. By the time the pastor finished speaking, my sister-in-law was gripping my arm and whispering my name, and I understood from the tone of it that she had figured out what I had not yet allowed myself to figure out. The woman across the grave looked up and found my face. We held each other's gaze for a moment that felt much longer than it was, and I watched her understand. And I watched her face do the thing that mine was probably doing. That particular collapse that happens when the architecture of your life gives way all at once, and you realize that the foundation was never what you believed it was. I am writing this because I spent the first year after that day completely silent about what happened, and the silence was eating me. I am writing this because there are things I did in the 14 months since the funeral that I am not ashamed of, that I need to say out loud, and that I believe every person reading this has the right to know a person can do when the worst thing happens and you decide not to disappear inside it. My name is Laura. I am 41 years old, and I was married to a man named Thomas for 14 years. We met at a work conference in Atlanta when I was 26 and he was 29. He spilled coffee on my presentation materials and spent the rest of the conference trying to make it up to me. It was a good story. We told it at our engagement party, at our wedding rehearsal dinner, at every dinner party for the first 5 years of our marriage, and it always landed. Thomas was good at stories. I understand now, in a way I couldn't have then, just how good he was. He was a regional sales director for a medical equipment company, which meant that he traveled regularly. Sometimes for a week at a time, sometimes longer, when a territory needed extra coverage or a client relationship needed managing. In 14 years of marriage, this had never struck me as unusual. It was the job he had when we met. It was the job he had when we married. And it was the job that paid for the house in Charlotte, and the vacations, and the life we had assembled together with the ordinary confidence of 2 people who believe they are building something permanent. We had 1 daughter together, Maya, who is now 12, and who is the reason I have managed to get out of bed every morning for the past 2 years, when getting out of bed felt like the most ambitious thing I could ask of myself. She has his eyes. I have made a deliberate and ongoing decision not to make that her fault or her burden, and I want to say that clearly because it matters to how this story ends. Our marriage, from the inside, looked like a good one, not a perfect one. I'm not interested in pretending it was frictionless, because no real marriage is. We argued about money occasionally, about his travel schedule, about the way he could be emotionally unavailable when he was stressed. He could go flat in a crisis, not cold exactly, but sealed, unreachable. like a person who had learned a long time ago to keep his interior life at a significant remove from whoever was watching. I had always attributed this to his childhood, which had been difficult in ways he talked about rarely and obliquely. I had spent 14 years extending him the generosity of that explanation. I understand now what that sealed quality actually was. He died of a heart attack at 43, sudden, no warning, in a hotel room in Columbus, Ohio, on a Sunday night in November. The hotel called me at 11:40 p.m. to tell me that my husband had been found unresponsive and that the paramedics had been unable to revive him. I sat on the kitchen floor for a very long time. Maya was asleep upstairs. I called my sister. I called his mother. I made the calls you make. And then I spent the next 36 hours in the particular suspended shock of a person who's been handed information so large that the mind can only process it in very small pieces, one at a time, over many hours. I did not yet know that the hotel in Columbus, the Marriott where Thomas had supposedly been attending a 2-day client dinner, was located 11 minutes from a house in a suburb called Westerville, a house with a yard, a swing set, a mailbox with a name on it that was not mine but was also, technically, mine. A house where a woman named Christine had lived with her 2 children for the past 9 years, believing, as completely and as foolishly as I had, that she was married to a man who loved her. The funeral was on a Tuesday. My sister-in-law, Thomas's sister Diane, who I want to say plainly is one of the most decent people I have ever known and who had absolutely no knowledge of any of this, had helped me arrange it. Thomas's mother was there, elderly and devastated and leaning on a cane. His work colleagues came in a cluster that stood slightly apart from the family the way work colleagues do at funerals. Neighbors, old friends, the ordinary gathering of a life that had been, from all available evidence, ordinary. Christine was standing with 2 children on the far side of the grave. I noticed her the way you notice something that doesn't fit the pattern. Not with alarm, not with understanding, just with the faint and uneasy awareness that something in the picture is wrong before you can name what it is. She was perhaps 35. She was composed in the way of someone working very hard to be composed. The children were dressed carefully, the way you dress children for formal occasions when you've had to explain to them that someone important is gone and that they need to behave. After the service, as people were moving toward the reception, I watched Diane approach her. I watched the brief conversation. I watched Diane's face change. And then Diane came to me, took my arm, and said very quietly, "Laura, I need you to come with me for a moment." We went to a quiet corner of the parking lot, away from everyone. Diane told me, as carefully and as directly as she could, what she had just learned. Christine had introduced herself using Thomas's last name. She had described him as her husband. She had said they had been married for 10 years. She had said the children, the boy was named James, the girl was named Rose, were his. I stood in the parking lot of a funeral home in Charlotte, North Carolina, on a cold Tuesday afternoon, and I felt the world reorganize itself around a new set of facts. Not with the dramatic, explosive quality that Betrayal has in movies, more like watching a structure that you have been living inside suddenly become transparent and seeing for the first time the scaffolding that was always there, that you had never examined. That was not what you had been told it was. I did not go back inside. I asked Diane to tell Christine that I would like to speak with her privately at a time of her choosing, and that I would make myself available whenever she was ready. Then I got in my car, drove home, relieved the babysitter, checked on Maya, and sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning trying to build a timeline in my head out of 14 years of memories. It is a particular kind of cognitive exercise, constructing a revised version of your own life. You go back through years of ordinary moments and you find the seams, the places where one reality was being maintained while another was being managed simultaneously. I found more of them than I expected. I also found fewer than I had feared, which was somehow worse because it meant he had been very good at it. The business trips to Columbus were approximately once a month, occasionally twice. Columbus was where Christine lived. Columbus was where James and Rose went to school, where Christine worked as a dental hygienist, where she had a life that was complete and ordinary, and entirely premised on a man who came home to her on Tuesday nights and left again on Thursday mornings, and told her, I would later learn, that he was the love of her life every single morning. Every single morning, he told us both. I keep coming back to that detail because it is the one that most defies my capacity for comprehension. Not the logistics of it, not the separate phones, the separate accounts, the decade of sustained deception, but the specific intimacy of that daily ritual, performed faithfully for two women who each believed it was exclusively theirs. That is not something you do accidentally or casually. That is something you practice. Christine called me 9 days after the funeral. We met at a coffee shop halfway between Charlotte and Westerville, a Panera Bread in a strip mall in a town that neither of us had any prior connection to, which felt appropriate. Neutral ground for a conversation that had no precedent in either of our lives. I want to tell you that it was hostile, or at least awkward, because that is what the situation seemed to call for. It was neither. Christine was a small, careful woman with dark circles under her eyes and a quality of exhausted precision that I recognized because I had been wearing the same thing for 9 days. She ordered coffee. I ordered tea. We sat across from each other for a moment before either of us spoke, and then she said, I didn't know about you. I want you to know that first. I said I believed her. I did. It was not a generosity. It was simply obvious. No one who knew the truth would have shown up at the graveside with 2 young children. No one who knew the truth would be sitting across from me with that particular look. The look of someone whose entire identity has been built on a premise that has just been revealed to be false. We talked for 3 hours. We compared what we knew, which is a strange and disorienting experience. 2 women building a biography of the same man using 2 sets of memories that only partially overlap. We discovered that he had told us both the same things about his childhood, the same anecdotes, the same self-mythology. He had been, in some fundamental way, performing the same character for 2 different audiences for an entire decade, and the character was consistent enough that neither of us had found a crack in it. Christine showed me photographs on her phone. Thomas at James's birthday party, Thomas teaching Rose to ride a bike, Thomas at Christine's sister's wedding, standing in a family photo with his arm around Christine's shoulder, looking exactly the way he looked in our family photos. Present, warm, entirely at ease. I showed her our vacation photos from the previous summer. We'd been to Maine. She had been to the Outer Banks 2 weeks later with him. The practical situation was this. Thomas had died intestate, meaning without a will. His financial life, which I was now discovering was considerably more complex than I had understood, was going to require legal attention. He had life insurance through his employer. He had retirement accounts. He had, it turned out, 2 mortgages. and he had two women who had both, in different states, believed they were legally married to him. Here is where I need to tell you something that I have thought carefully about how to explain. Thomas's marriage to Christine, the ceremony, the license, the legal documentation, had taken place in Ohio 3 years after our wedding, which meant that our marriage, the one performed first, was the legal one. Christine's marriage, technically and legally, was not. She had not known this. She had been a woman who believed she was married and had lived that belief for a decade. The discovery that she was not in the eyes of the law, not on paper, was a blow that landed on top of every other blow, and I watched her process it across a table at a Panera Bread with a composure that I can only describe as the composure of a person who has no choice. What I did next is the part I want to be careful about explaining, because it is the part that some people will not understand and that others will understand immediately. I called a lawyer the following Monday, not to fight Christine, not to claim everything that was legally mine and leave her with nothing. I called a lawyer because Thomas had made decisions that affected two families, and I was the only person in a position to make sure that those decisions did not destroy both of them. Christine had 2 children. James was 8, Rose was 5. They had done nothing wrong. They had no father. And the legal and financial complexity that Thomas had left behind was going to determine what their next years looked like. Their school, their stability, the texture of their daily lives. And I was not willing to let his deception be the thing that punished them for it. I want to be honest about something. This was not a selfless decision. It was also a decision made in the particular clarity that grief and rage sometimes produce together. The clarity of someone who has been through the worst thing and has decided specifically and deliberately not to become smaller because of it. I was furious. I am still furious in the deep and manageable way that I think I will carry for a long time. But fury and fairness are not incompatible, and I had enough of both to do what I did next. Thomas's mother knew. I discovered this 4 weeks after the funeral in a phone call that began as a condolence check-in and became something else entirely when his mother, who was 81 and apparently done with carrying the weight of her son's secrets, told me that she had known about Christine since year 3, that Thomas had come to her, that she had begged him to end one or the other, that he had not, that she had made a choice she was not proud of, and that she was sorry, and that she would understand if I never spoke to her again. I held the phone for a long time after she said that, and then I told her that I appreciated her honesty and that I would be in touch. I have been in touch. It is complicated. She is 81, and she loved her son, and she made a terrible choice, and she is living inside that choice now. I have not found a clean resolution to how I feel about her. I have found a workable one. Diane, Thomas's sister, knew nothing. I am certain of this. The devastation on her face when she understood what she was looking at in that parking lot was not the devastation of revelation. It was the devastation of discovery. She has been, in the months since, one of the most steadfast people in my life. She's also been steadfast in Christine's life, which I asked her to be. It has not been easy for her. I think about that often. 6 weeks after the funeral, my lawyer, a woman named Sandra, who had been recommended by 3 separate people and who turned out to be exactly as formidable as advertised, requested access to Thomas's full financial history as part of the estate process. What she found took her 3 days to map and another hour to explain to me in a way I could follow. Thomas had not been a regional sales director for the past 4 years. He had left that job in 2019, quietly, on terms that involved a non-disclosure agreement that his former employer had enforced, and had been operating since then as an independent contractor, working for 2 competing medical equipment companies simultaneously, both of which believed he was exclusively theirs. He had, in essence, been running the same deception in his professional life that he had been running in his personal one. 2 employers, 2 identities, 2 sets of loyalties, none of them complete. The money from both positions, combined as significant income, had been flowing into accounts that neither Christine nor I knew about. Not hiding money from us exactly, because we both had comfortable lives and both had our reasonable needs met, but building something separate. A third account in a holding structure that had been accumulating for 4 years and that had a balance that made Sandra pause when she read it to me. Thomas had been planning to leave. Both of us. He had been building a financial exit, not toward another woman, as far as Sandra could determine, but simply toward a version of his own life that neither of us was part of. The double life had itself been a holding pattern. He had been waiting for a number. He had almost reached it. He died 11 months short of whatever he had decided was enough. I sat with that information for a long time. The grief I felt was not for him, exactly. Not anymore. It was for the version of him I had believed in, and for Christine, who deserved to know what Sandra had found. I called her that evening. We talked for 2 hours. At the end of the call, I told her what I had already decided, that the hidden accounts, once the estate was settled, would be divided between the 2 families. Not equally between the 2 of us. Proportionally, taking into account the children, taking into account the years, taking into account what was fair rather than what was strictly legal. Sandra told me I did not have to do this. I told her I was aware of that. The estate took 11 months to fully settle. It was not simple, and it was not pleasant, and there were moments in conference rooms, across tables stacked with documents, in phone calls that ran past midnight, when I felt the particular exhaustion of a person who is doing the right thing and cannot afford to stop. Sandra was methodical and tireless. I was determined in the way that grief sometimes makes a person determined, not with energy exactly, but with a kind of locked-in focus that doesn't leave room for distraction. In the end, the legal estate, the house in Charlotte, the retirement accounts, the life insurance, came to me as the legal spouse. The hidden accounts, after taxes and legal fees, were divided as I had decided. A portion for Maya's college fund, a portion structured as a trust for James and Rose administered through Christine, and the remainder split between us for the immediate costs of rebuilding 2 lives that had been structurally dependent on a man who was not coming back. Christine and I are not friends. I want to be clear about that because I think the narrative arc of this kind of story sometimes gets romanticized in a way that isn't honest. We are 2 women who share a tragedy and who made a choice, together, to handle that tragedy with more grace than the situation deserved. We text occasionally. At Christmas, she sent Maya a gift that was thoughtful enough that I cried a little when I saw it, for reasons I could not have fully articulated. James and Rose know that Maya exists. Maya knows that they exist. How those relationships develop over time is something I am holding loosely without expectation. Thomas's mother and I still speak, infrequently, with a care on both sides that contains everything that is unresolved between us and that functions anyway. She is 81. She lost her son. The choices she made are not ones I can fully absolve, but I am not interested in spending my remaining time with her in the accounting of them. That is not mercy. It is just practicality. I have limited energy and I have decided what to spend it on. Diane is my closest friend. She became that through this, which is a strange and real thing about disasters. Sometimes they clarify who belongs in your life, not because the disaster is a gift, but because it removes the ambient noise and shows you what was always true underneath it. Diane was always the best person in that family. I simply hadn't seen it as clearly before I needed it. I have thought a great deal in the past 2 years about what I know and don't know about the man I was married to. The honest accounting is this: I do not know whether he loved me. I believe that he did. I cannot now verify that belief against a revised understanding of who he was, and I have made a decision to stop trying. The love I felt was real. What it was a response to may have been partially constructed. These two things can both be true, and living with both of them is something I'm still learning. What I know is that Maya is doing well, not perfectly, not without the grief that comes with losing a father at 11, and then learning, gradually and carefully, that the father was more complicated than she knew. We are in family therapy. Her therapist is excellent. Maya is a remarkably resilient person in the way that some children are resilient. Not because they are protected from hard things, but because they have been given the tools to process them. I take some credit for that. I take more credit for it than I would have before all of this, which is something. I am not dating. I am not ready to date. I have been told by several well-meaning people that I will be ready eventually, and I believe them in an abstract way, and I am not in any hurry to test it. What I am doing is working and maintaining friendships that I had let go slightly thin during the marriage, because Thomas had been so entirely the center of my social world. There is a version of this story where the central drama is Thomas, who he was, why he did what he did, whether he was a monster or a coward, or something more complicated than either. I have thought about that version of the story. I have decided not to tell it, because I think it is the wrong center. He is not the protagonist of this story. He is the event that clarified everything, who I was, what I was capable of, what I was willing to do with the worst morning of my life. I stood at a graveside and I watched a structure that I had built my entire adult life inside collapse in real time, and I made a choice not to collapse with it. That choice did not feel heroic in the moment. It felt like the only thing available that wasn't dissolving. But 2 years later, on the far side of 11 months of legal proceedings and thousands of dollars in therapy and 100 conversations I never expected to have with a woman I never expected to know, I am here. The structure is different. It is smaller in some ways and larger in others. It is mine in a way it was not before, because before, it was built around a lie I didn't know was a lie, and now it is built around things I have tested and found to be true. That is not a small thing. I am trying to treat it like the large thing it is. If you are reading this and you are somewhere in the middle of the worst thing, the part where the floor is gone and the walls are gone, and you cannot yet see what you're standing on, I want to say this to you as plainly as I can. What you do with the information is yours, not the recovery, not the timeline, not the way you're supposed to feel about the person who did this. Yours. You do not owe anyone a performance of how you handle this. You only owe yourself the honesty of handling it in a way you can live with. That bar is lower than it feels right now, and it turns out to be enough.